Okay, everyone. I think we'll get started. We've got an incredible lineup of speakers for you this morning, and only about 70 minutes to use them. And I'd love to allow some time for conversation, questions at the end of this session. My name is Carolyn Bull. I'm a Distinguished Advisor at the ANU National Security College. Had the privilege of still working at the Security College when we kicked off these consultations, and have been very privileged indeed to stay on the advisory committee for the consultations as they've unfolded over the last 2 years. We've got some very, very interesting findings on the social dimensions of national security coming out of the data from the studies. What I will do is ask each of our speakers a sort of a general question to keep the conversation going. Please feel free, though, other speakers, if you'd like to pitch in and respond directly to the speaker who's got the floor, please do, and then we'll have some time for conversation and questions at the end. I'll just do a very quick introduction of our speakers. You have their bios in your conference pack. And before I do that, just quickly to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and conversing today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So welcome. So immediately to my right, we have Julianne Schultz. Julianne is Professor Emerita of Media and Culture, and she's an acclaimed author and national leader in cultural policy, media and public debate, founding editor and former publisher of the Griffith Review. And Julianne has held many key governance and advisory roles, including chair of the Conversation Media Group, chair of the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and director roles at the ABC, the Grattan Institute and the Copyright Agency. Welcome, Julianne. We have Duncan Lewis, Professor in the Practice of National Security at the ANU National Security College, former Director General of Security, Head of ASIO, Secretary of the Department of Defence, and Australian Ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, the EU and NATO. Welcome, Duncan. Then to Duncan's right, we have Rebecca Skinner, the former CEO of Services Australia and a Distinguished Advisor with the National Security College. Rebecca has an incredibly broad and substantive leadership background across defence, strategic policy, intelligence coordination, crisis management and organisational transformation. Amongst many other things. To Rebecca's right, we have Tom Rogers, a former Australian Electoral Commissioner. He is also a Distinguished Advisor with the National Security College, and has delivered, as you would all know, many federal elections, referendums, boundary redistributions, and really built the Australian Electoral Commission into one of Australia's most trusted institutions. Finally, right up the end there, he needs no introduction, Tim Wilford, our MC and drummer extraordinaire for today, and the brains and the driver behind the community consultations process.
Bit of a ring-in.
Sorry?
Bit of a ring-in.
Yeah, a ring-in. Our ring-in for the day. No, this is the man who has kept this process going and on track for the best part of 2 years, and we owe him, this country owes him a great debt of gratitude for doing that. So there are speakers. So what I'm going to do is, and I know it's a bit clunky, but we're going to go in a little row along here and start with Julianne with one of the really foundational questions I think that comes out of this process, and that is, does it actually matter what society thinks about national security, Julianne, and if so, why?
Thank you. Talking about being the ring-in, I think I'm the ring-in here. I mean, I don't come from a defence or intelligence background, but hopefully my observations will broaden the discussion a little bit. Look, I think absolutely it matters that people that we know what people think about in terms of security, and that the base is broadened. And I think that what this huge project has shown is something which has come up in a whole bunch of other research in recent times, and that is that that there is a bigger question that needs to be asked and discussed, which is about belonging and social cohesion and participation in the society. Because national security is not going to make any sense unless you've got that sort of cohesive cultural and social base. And so this report, or these reports, the big Scanlon report on social cohesion, which I know is subject of later conversation, and the McKinnon Democracy report, which is being released today, next hour or so, are all pointing to some of the same sort of fractures. So I think that we need to be very acutely aware of that in thinking about what the sort of issue of security is. I think in a post-World War II environment, Australia's obviously had a very active both defence and intelligence sort of role here and abroad. But I think there's been to some degree a sort of complacency that we're a long way away, that, the world's basically run in a sort of a way in which the sort of rule of law prevails, and that gave a reasonable degree of security, which could in a way, I guess, be addressed by machines, by the sort of whole defence apparatus of buying equipment and, equipping properly defence forces, by international agreements, by a robust intelligence system, and by a government which is taking these things actively. So it's just that sort of complacency, I think, in a way, made people not really have to worry too much about national security or think beyond those big instruments of government power. But now, of course, what we see is a world that's making less and less sense. And in a way, that was less obvious than it is now, because the ease of access to communications is such that we can see day by day disasters unrolling around the world. We watch the US president like he's a soap star, making various pronouncements from hour to hour. And I think that sense of complacency in a world which is clearly very, very unstable makes people think quite differently about what national security might mean. And I think in a way, two major events. I mean, one is the signing of the AUKUS agreement, and the massive amount of public money that's now been committed to that project. I think that there is obviously a growing sense of public unease about AUKUS and the amount of money that's involved, and how it takes resources away from other areas of national security. And I think one of the really powerful things of this report is that it shows that people's sense of what they need for national security is not necessarily bound up in more big machines, that there's a whole lot of other stuff that needs to be done. And I think the other issue was, of course, was Bondi, as has already been mentioned. Now, who knows? We still don't know a lot about Bondi. I mean, the trials haven't been held, the Royal Commission hasn't presented. But at one level, at least, it looks like some sort of failure of intelligence at a time when intelligence agencies have had more resources and more capacity than probably ever before. So I think that adds to people being nervous. I just want to use a line, because I think there's a way of capturing some of this which is quite useful. That a colleague of mine, a psychoanalyst, Alan Schaefer, has come up with, and I'd just like to use it, to quote it. He diagnoses the loss of optimism that's around as deriving from widespread social depression, a collective state of despair, anxiety and polarisation driven by global violence, political manipulation, trauma and the collapse of nuanced dialogue. Sorry, my phone's been weird. Adjust. Don't do that. Anyway, that's enough of the quote. The point of it is that what he's detecting is a degree of social depression, and how you deal with social depression is really much more complex than just saying, "Oh, let them all sort it out." I mean, everyone's feeling it in their daily lives, and that adds to that feeling of needing a different sort of approach to national security. I think it's really striking that that safety and peace showed up as the strongest, aspiration that people had in the survey. But we've been seeing the fracturing of that, very, very directly at home, and the sort of the fragility of it. And I would point to the outcome of the referendum as one of the examples of that. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, misinformation and so on in the report. And I think that's when we first saw big misinformation playing in a political sphere in Australia. And so that sort of was one of the really early fractures. The other things, obviously, that have touched people very directly in terms of feeling secure in their nation is the sort of climate disasters. And we've had them rolling out year after year now, floods, fires, that really touch people very, very personally and very directly. So I think that I answer your question and say, yes, it's really important to do that, it seems to me that it becomes really important that we start to think about social cohesion in a way which just goes beyond the sort of the words which most frequently are used, which are about rule of law and freedom. It seems to me that if we're really talking about social cohesion, we need to be thinking much more broadly about the whole society. And a cohesive society is going to feel more secure. To my mind, the OECD definition of social cohesion is actually more helpful than the ones that are currently floating around in the Australian discourse. And that is, a cohesive society works towards the well-being of all its members, fights exclusion and marginalisation, creates a sense of belonging, promotes trust, and offers its members the opportunity for upward mobility. It would seem to me that they're all preconditions for developing a broader expansive definition of what national security might be and how you can actually try to foster that sense of belonging and aspiration, which feels, I think, for very many people to have been closed off. And that shows up very much in the Scanlon results, which show this sort of decreasing sense of belonging and decreasing sense of identification of what it actually means to be Australian. And that's a really hard conversation to have because it's actually got to be a dialogue, not something which is pronounced from the top. So as part of that, I guess what I'm hoping to see from this is that, yes, to embrace that much more expansive definition, find new ways of doing the dialogue, but also recognise where the flaws are in the existing system. One image which sticks in my mind is, although invasion and military attack is not high on the list of the things that people recognise, when you look at the most recent National Defence Security Review, the question of personnel and numbers of people in the ADF is a huge issue. It's not enough people to even half fill or just half fill the MCG. So you're talking about a defence system which in a way has also, in this complacency, got pulled away from the reality of people's lives. Half the MCG, that's not a defence force for a country of this size.
Thanks, Julianne, and so much to unpack there. I mean, for me, in a nutshell, if you go back to the old sort of state-society contract, one of the, if not the most important thing that the state is meant to provide for society is security. And if the society's understanding of security or expectations of security are not met, then that state-society contract immediately starts to break down. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, I guess, the way I think about it. Do any of our other panellists want to jump in on this question, or are we happy to move along? Duncan.
Carolyn, if I might just take up on Julianne's point about the community anxiety about the sort of kaleidoscope of information that's coming into them through multimedia. My friend James Comey, the former head of the FBI, very famously about 10 years ago talked about accelerated anxiety. And he was of the view that all of us were subject to accelerated anxiety because of this barrage of information that was coming into us. And I must say, my wife Jenny thinks I'm a sad little man. I jump out of bed in the morning and the first thing I'm doing is looking at the device. And the device is telling me about catastrophe that's happened all over the world. And so I worry about those things, even though there is nothing at all that I can do about most of it. So you're like a voyeur, if you like, on these issues. And I think that's a very powerful motivator for many people in the community. You are concerned because it's in front of your face every day. In previous times, of course, you would have known nothing about it.
That's a great segue into the next question, which is actually for Duncan. So keep your microphone primed. So just unpacking some of the findings of the surveys, which you've already heard a bit from Rory earlier, but there's very clear finding throughout these consultations that the social interpretations and priorities for security do diverge quite significantly from those very traditional notions of hard power and geostrategic threat that have tended to drive government policy making in the past. The surveys find that most Australians think a lot less about things like alliances, defence capability, state-based threats, and much more, as Duncan has said, about the immediate personal issues that relate to everyday life, peace and safety in the community, economic stability, trusted information. As Rory mentioned earlier, the very top security priority for Australians was safe and peaceful communities. There were also, when we unpacked the findings and asked Australians about specific national security threats, they rated threats like AI-enabled attacks, disinformation, supply chain disruption, economic crisis as their most serious concerns. So these are sort of issues that do sit outside those so-called traditional national security priorities. So to me, that raises some really key questions about how government should frame its priorities, but also how it should set and communicate Australia's national security priorities to the public. There's a question in my mind about, is government out of step with its citizens? So my question to Duncan is, do you think there is actually a genuine, a real disconnect between the way government is approaching national security and the way people are experiencing it? Or is the problem not so much a real disconnect, but just an issue of how government is framing and communicating its priorities?
Carolyn, I think in short the answer is yes to a degree to both of those things, but let me come back and answer more fully in a moment. First of all, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here today and to have the opportunity to have been on the steering committee for this community consultation. I want to compliment Rory, Tim and the team for the work they've done. As a former Secretary of Defence, I was involved tangentially in a couple of community consultations around white paper development and so on. Nothing was of the depth and the breadth and the nuance and the sophistication of this survey, so well done. The utility of the report, I think, is enormous. It sort of goes partly to your question. I will come back directly to that. But the utility of this report, I think, will be significant. It will be impactful for governments, plural, at all levels, I think, will be able to draw from this. It'll be impactful for the think tank academic community, those policy makers, the policy framers in the community. I think it'll be impactful for business leaders and for community leaders. So there is much to be drawn from it. I was intrigued by the fact we took basically 3 probes in time, one in November 2024, another one sort of later in 2025, and then the last one after the Bondi attack. And it's quite interesting to see how and Rory spoke to this, how there was an escalation in perception of threat during that time. And, I'm reminded of Harold Macmillan, the former British Prime Minister, when asked what kept him awake at night, said, events, dear boy, events. And so it is that these events that occurred, because there was the American unilateral attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities, which came after our first probe, and we saw a rise. And then later on the Bondi attack, and there was a further kick. So it went from, as Rory said, it was about 53% that were concerned or very concerned about security, up to 72 or 73%, I think, after when we did the final probe. I think that the range of issues were something of a surprise to me. There were things in the review that were of no surprise, but there were some very surprising community responses. And for me, as a person who's been involved in the national security debate in this town most of my working life, the issues around AI, fears of cyber attack, supply chain interruption, economic blows, a lot of stuff about cost of living and the intersection between the economy and security. these are things that governments need to listen to, which comes back to your question. I think there is a disconnect between government and the community. To this point, national security has been the purview of a few experts, if you like, people that are involved in the business and not the wider community. But quite obviously now, the community wants to know more. Our facts and figures showed that there was a desire to know more. There was a great expression of people frustrated that they were not receiving as much information as they wanted. There was a very interesting gender slice in that, where women were far more concerned that they knew less and were not getting enough from government than men. So it's very clear to me that the messaging part, which is the second part of your question, the messaging from government to the community needs to be sharpened and needs to be, well, this is contradictory, it needs to be broadened. Do you understand where I'm going here? I mean, there needs to be more of it, but it needs to be, quite specific as to the concerns of sectors of the community. My last point is that there were several vertical cuts, if you like, in this information. I've mentioned gender, but there was, of course, an age cut through the data, and then there was a geographic cut, rural-urban. And the last one of those, the rural-urban thing didn't really surprise me. We've always known that concern for national security grows in direct proportion to the number of kilometres you live away from Canberra. And so, when you're in sort of far northwest Western Australia or Queensland, concern about those things is more elevated than if you're living in Pitt Street in Sydney. So that was not a surprise, but I think I was, and perhaps the age one was not so much a surprise, except there was a sliver on the bottom of the age group, I can't remember what it was, but 25s and under, I think, who had an elevated concern above what we had expected, and certainly above those between, say, 25 and about 50, I think it was, so kind of people in the middle of the age span. So that was a bit of a surprise, and it shows me that there is a concern among the young, and most of those concerns seem to go towards the issues that Julianne was mentioning around climate change, around safe and secure communities and peaceful communities. So I might stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. And actually, I might just go straight to Rebecca before circling back to the panel, because the question I have for her is quite closely related. If we do accept that there is a disconnect between social understandings and expectations and the priorities and policies that government is setting, do you, Rebecca, think that the government's priorities, the government's policies or structures actually do need to change? And if so, how far would you push that change? So, for example, should we be looking at structural pressures like housing and the cost of living and treating them as core national security issues? Should things like infrastructure failures be embedded in Australia's national security policies and institutions? And if so, how and how far do we take that?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here today and also to have participated, like Duncan, in supporting Tim and the NSC team in doing this really important work. I think probably, there's no simple answer to that. It's a bit yes and a bit no. There's a risk if you think about dragging everything into a national security context. I guess my experience running Services Australia through particularly the COVID crisis, probably the idea that SAFE had broader application was probably less of a surprise to me than it might have been before I had engaged in that sort of type of role where you could really see community anxiety much closer than you can if you are embedded as the sort of head of strategic policy in defence or participating in purchasing military capability. So this idea that Australians think about security from a whole of everyday life perspective means we do need to think about it differently. We are in a Westminster system, so this idea and the way we allocate money, the way we have policy expertise is in these tighter lanes around defence, around intelligence, around social policy. So I think it's probably, it's not a fair proposition to think that you would throw all of that up in order to deal with national security in a different way. And if you did try to bundle everything in, it would soon overwhelm a system. But what I would say is that, I'm very confident that when it all boils down to it, we have all the skills and experiences that we need. The issue is, how do we access them, and how do we access them to solve more complex systemic problems? So if people want to be safer in a cyber landscape, how do we do that while we access all of the various knowledge? It's not just, what I'm really sort of promoting here is the idea that you put a lead agency out there and then have them coordinate. That's not really that's not really a fit for purpose model to solve today's problems, because we can see that they're so interconnected and people are concerned for their well-being based on some of these sorts of things. So the opportunity here is to reimagine how it is that you solve these complex problems, and that might require some broader definition from in terms of government setting an agenda, then the way in which the public sector and others respond to that agenda is in a more coordinated and integrated way. So, what do I sort of, how do you fix that? Well, I think there's a couple of examples that come to mind at the moment. We sit now on the precipice of fuel shortages. And you pick up the newspaper and there's long lamented opinion pieces about how everybody knew there was a fuel security problem, but we never did anything about it. That sort of rear view mirror look. One way to ask yourself, where did that sort of policy issue get generated? Well, it did mainly get generated out of a deep national security perspective around enabling that very harder-edged idea of national security, which is being able to deploy your military capabilities, as Julianne mentioned. And it strikes me that at that time when you're discussing those issues, was the Department of Agriculture in the room? Was the Department of Industry in the room? Was there local councils in the room? Was there state governments in the room? Because at the end of the day, where do we really end up if we don't have an assured supply of petrochemicals? We actually end up without fertiliser, without an ability to do farm work and move things, and we don't have any plastics and polypipe, so we can't build a house because there's no polypipe to do the plumbing and there's no diesel to do the earthwork. So perhaps our policy position on how you might have done that differently could have been more compelling had there been a greater diversity of view in the room to help make that sort of more systemic argument. So we don't tend to look. We're in a system of systems, and we need to be, as a collective, looking to try to solve those bigger questions with more diversity. So not staying in our stovepipes and thinking that others don't have a view for us to work into solving great, large policy problems. So I do think there's a role here to reimagine or strengthen how we do the integration and coordination of large policy problems that we need to work through. I'm a great believer that we're a clever country with clever policymakers, smart people, scientists. We have everything we need. It's just the way in which we harness it and the way in which we think about security and safety for people. As CEO of Services Australia, just to finish on a sort of illustrative example, we had, 1.4 million job seekers out of nowhere, queues around the block. the agency was incredibly focused on how do we get those payments, so very task focused on how do we get all those people their money. And we did all of that at speed and a range of things like that, which was terrific, and marvelled, and a whole bunch of people from across industry and the public sector assisted us. But it was later that I reflected that we had delivered a national security outcome. Because by getting people money so that they retained dignity and the ability to feed their families in short order, supported social cohesion and supported a calmness in the community that other countries did not experience. But there's no way anybody at the time was thinking that getting that sort of work done quickly was a national security issue. And we later did the COVID certificate, as people might remember, their little certificate on their phone. Everybody wanted one, and we integrated it with the check-in apps working with states and territories. Again, a great token, but that was material in opening up, firstly, the domestic economy in Australia, and then the international economy in Australia. But I would say that in nearly all cases, we don't really harness those views from social policy and service delivery because they're often disconnected from that main conversation around military and capability effect. Whereas if we do not keep the community safe, and that definition of what cohesion looks like is extremely important, and I think we have to work at pace. We're thoughtful, clever people, but we have to work faster in this way. And we need to work in a more integrated and coordinated way, and that probably really has to be partially driven by an adjusted approach from central agencies and an adjusted mindset from policymakers about arriving at the problem, seeking to be curious about everything they can find out about it and who of their colleagues across the Commonwealth and other places might know about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I'm really glad that you mentioned local government and systems within systems and integration at all levels, because it seems to me that a great deal of the delivery of national security lies at the community level, lies with local governments, state and territory governments, and whether it's flood payments, whether it's education, whether it's dealing with somebody who's been the subject of a scam, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess a question to the panel, what more can we do to bridge that disconnect or the difference in framing at all levels of government? I know this will come up in a later session, but just to touch on it briefly, to any of our panellists who'd like to comment on that or any other aspects that Rebecca has just raised or Duncan has raised. Julianne.
I think the local government thing is incredibly interesting and really important. But local government is actually at the end of a tail. They do what they can because they sit underneath the legislative frameworks of state governments. There's no constitutional recognition of local government. And so we put a lot of stuff onto what happens at a local government area, whether it's through the governance process itself or through the sort of associated volunteer agencies which sort of tend to organise around local governments. And it actually sits there as the least resourced part of the government thing, the one that people have in many ways, most daily connection with. So, I mean, there are a lot of things in the sort of institutional structure of Australia, of which this is one, which we've never quite been able to grasp. And I think, if you're to have that big conversation about what national security looks like and what belonging looks like, you actually have to have that bigger conversation about the structures of the whole society. Now, I know nobody wants to go there, but I think it's a really crucial thing.
Yeah, look, just quickly, I would certainly agree with a lot of what's been said already. I think for me, one of the things that's come out of the report, and I guess changed my thinking to some extent, is that this is as much a cultural issue as it is a policy issue. And I think if you're thinking that way, it changes a lot of the questions you ask around what now. And that goes to how involved sort of individuals should be, families and households, but also, institutions like local government. And I'll speak a lot more to, I think, some of the data in a moment.
Fantastic. Thanks. Did you have something, Duncan? And then I'm going to turn to Tom for the next question.
Your question about how we might sort of turn this around, if there is a disconnect that we've talked about. We have been saying, those of us in the national security community have been saying for many years that there was a requirement for a much richer dialogue between the government and the community in order to get this social licence that I think maybe Rory mentioned earlier on today. The social licence that then gives the government the freedom to take steps, whether that be financial or policy or whatever it is that they're doing. But and it seems to me that if we want to actually, I'm quite positive about this now because it seems there is a wave of community concern from what we're polling. Our elected officials, of course, are sensitive to what is happening in the community, so there will be a natural positive outcome of that. But at the same time, I wouldn't absolve officials at all levels of government from leaning forward on this with the elected representatives to make sure that there is some velocity behind this change. So, it really requires a fair bit of effort from particularly Commonwealth officials, but also state and territories, and to the extent noting those constraints that Julianne just spoke about for local government.
Tom.
Not that I'm touting for business, but there's an excellent session later this morning that I happen to be facilitating with some of Australia's most experienced mayors, and I know that this will come up in great detail. So if you are so inclined and you'd like some extra information about that, please feel free to turn up to that session.
I'll definitely be there, Tom. Okay, and while you've got the microphone, Tom, so one of the other key findings, and Rory mentioned this in our opening as well, one of the other key findings of our work was that relates to trust in the information environment. It's very clear that Australians want more transparency about security threats. But at the same time, many of the participants, for example, in our focus groups, were quite anxious about information overload, too much information, how do I find the information? And even more anxious about the very polluted information environment in which we are currently existing, and the sense that really both undermined trust in messaging from the government and elsewhere, but also contributed to polarisation of communities, rise of extremism and so forth. So my question is for Tom. What does societal resilience to disinformation and misinformation actually look like? Does information literacy, for example, need to be a core national security capability that governments and educators and civil society need to invest in? If so, how?
Thanks, Carolyn. Look, I might just talk about why we are where we are with such a high rating for mis and disinformation in the report. And it's probably not unusual. I was sort of reflecting back. When I first went to the AEC in 2012 as the deputy, not only did we have no social media policy, we had no Twitter presence, no nothing. And in fact, we set up a Twitter presence. I authorised it as the deputy without actually understanding what Twitter was. And when it went bad for us about 6 months later, we had to get some young people in to explain how to message. So if you think about it, in kind of just a little over a decade, we're now grappling with this issue that's become all-consuming. And that's why it's become such a topic. And clearly, people are worried by it. And I've sort of reflected on the report, and I've tried to make sense myself. And I think what I read in the report is that as people who have been in the national security community traditionally have looked at security from the border outwards, whereas citizens have looked from the front door outwards. And they're certainly aware of the border, but they're really been looking at the impacts of them on their daily life. And this is changing dramatically because of those things that we just said, that we've got an increase in mis and disinformation. I think at the moment, disinformation or misinformation is listed as the number 2 risk on the World Economic Forum for the next 2 years. I think it was number 1 and slipped down to number 2, and the number 1 is now, I think, geoeconomic shock. Please don't look that up because I'll probably be wrong as you're sitting there. But this is a thing that people are really grappling with. So back to the question about what does it look like. I think if you look globally at everything that's going on, everyone's tackling this slightly differently. That the EU are probably the leaders in this at the moment with the Digital Services Act and the European Commission with the Democracy Shield, but there's kind of only three things that are going on. The first of those is legislate, and there's all sorts of legislation being trialled internationally, including in the EU, to try and make societies resilient and reduce the amount of dis and misinformation effectively. The second thing is moderate, and that's where you've got a mechanism to deal with dangerous, inauthentic behaviour online and misinformation that pops up. And the third one is educate. So they're the three kind of broad buckets in which all of our responses fit: legislate, moderate, or educate. From my perspective, the one that shows the biggest benefit is education. Legislation is very long term, particularly the bit about legislation where we're trying to pressure the platforms. Moderation's important, complex when you talk about moderation, because we start to get into areas of censorship, and we're talking here about trust and truth, and these are really difficult things. But education is critical. And I know that even Rory this morning spoke about media literacy, which I think is so critical. But I think more broadly, digital literacy is a critical skill. And when I say digital literacy, I mean digital literacy, the ability to operate online, understand how it works. Then media literacy, that bit about understanding how information is served up to us. And the third part of that is civics literacy. And that's the ability to understand how our country works, so we can have long-term, robust conversations about who we are and where we want to move to. So for me, they're the critical things that I would see, and we do need to invest urgently and in a large scale in digital and media literacy. I'd used a figure once before. This is so rough, but my own assessment is that over about 20 years, we might have spent as much as $11 billion on government ads at the Commonwealth and state level. Now, some of those have been very worthwhile, particularly anything done by the AEC during a particular period. But a lot of them are eminently forgettable. And if we'd taken just a fraction of that money, not even new money, and put it towards digital and media literacy, we'd be much better off. And just to finish that point, we're in a new age now with artificial intelligence really creating an issue, and we're seeing information served up. I use these sort of 3 V words as a way of, for me, as a mental hook, but we're seeing information at a volume we've never seen before, at a velocity we've never seen before, but more worryingly, with a veracity we've never seen before. And it's really beginning to swamp our information networks. It's starting to twist our understanding, and this is something we need to deal with through education and media literacy.
And the survey certainly confirmed that widespread concern about AI-enabled disruption. Rebecca, I can see.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. The sort of terrifying figure of $11 billion. This is where I think the sort of .gov.au type of opportunity is a safe haven for information, because that's the piece that you can generally rely on to have been the best version of truth that you can get. We have infrastructure like MyID connected to MyGov platforms, and if we can just think as part of a safe and security approach to the world, to invest in those things where people have got somewhere safe to go, have got somewhere safe to do their transactions, have got somewhere safe to be with their identity, then we do go a long way to making people be able to travel through most of their life, which they do on digital highways, as opposed to, focusing on, more bridges or roadwork. So I do think we need to think of our national infrastructure and ensuring that those places are invested in ways that are helpful to the citizen to navigate in safe ways and provide a bit of a safe harbour and haven.
Tom?
And just the excellent findings in the report, the bit about information is really interesting, about who said they wanted more information or less information. I think there was a couple of things for me. It looked like people didn't want necessarily amplification, but simplification of that message in a way that they could understand it. And then the second part of that is actually who's giving that message. And it was interesting to see those security agencies pop out as really trusted agencies in the report. And I think it was agencies that do stuff were more trusted than agencies that just talk about stuff. And it might help us as we start designing some of those messages as well.
Yeah, very good point. Did you want to add something?
Can I? I think that all makes a lot of sense. One of the things, though, that obviously we're dealing with is a information ecosystem which is actually designed to confuse, obfuscate, mislead. I mean, it's not just, it's good you can go to your MyGov thing and get something that's useful. I mean, if you can navigate it, because it has problems. But the ecosystem, the global ecosystem in which we are working, is one which is designed to encourage feeling, not thinking. It's designed to encourage, you're feeling depressed, you're going to act out rather than think, actually, what are the steps along this? So I don't actually know, it would take an amazing sort of rethink of the way policymakers and governments work to actually try and intervene in that in a way that equips people with the capacity to make rational decisions. I mean, I'm sure we all get taken in by rubbish that's online, and we're all highly experienced and literate, but for people who don't even have the skills that we've had in dealing with complex information, it terrifies me.
I know I'm terrified every time my children turn to Wikipedia for their information. Doesn't matter how many times I say, look at the .gov.au website.
Wikipedia doesn't cover everything.
No, but Wikipedia said. I mean, yeah. Look, I'm going to turn to Tim for our final question so that we have some time for audience participation. One of the, as Duncan mentioned, one of the really interesting things about the study was the gaps, the gender gap and the age differentiation in perceptions about national security, but specifically in self-perception about knowledge of national security issues. So there was a very large gender gap between women and men as to, who felt that they knew that they were enabled and understood about national security issues. Very sort of significant sense that not just women but culturally diverse communities and ordinary citizens felt or were self-excluding from national security debates, even though when we had those conversations and had those focus groups, those groups actually showed a very sophisticated and very nuanced understanding of national security issues. Tim, so that difference was really quite amazing. Tim, what do you think it would actually take to broaden societal participation in these very critical debates?
Thank you. Well, the first thing to say, everybody on this panel has really contributed a lot to the work, and so for that, thank you. And I think the spirit of curiosity and generosity extends also to the people that we met on the road, hundreds of people. And again, thank you to all of you for joining us today. To your specific question, I think, again, I think of this as much a cultural issue as a policy issue. And the reason I say that is, like you mentioned, on the road and in the surveys, we certainly were hearing from people that they didn't feel like they belonged in the national security conversation. So if you'll permit me to read another quote from our report, because I do think it really speaks to this perception that people have of being outside the tent, if you like. Interview participant said, "You asked the question, how concerned are you about national security? How much do you think about national security?" Well, not much, because I don't have the bandwidth for it. But if you'd asked me, how much do I think about cybersecurity or climate change or just community unrest, then you would have got a different answer. So I think what that speaks to in my mind is that there's a bit of a disconnect in the language that is being used. And that might sound quite soft and fluffy, but I really do think it matters a lot, especially when we know we need to bring people on the journey, especially with increasing amounts of hard decisions, trade-offs that will inevitably be required in the environment that we find ourselves. So going to the sort of demographics specifically, in the survey work, we found that 23% of women said that they were knowledgeable about national security, and double that number of men thought that they were knowledgeable. And on the road, usually women would say, well, that's no surprise. And I think what is interesting is that when we got into the focus groups, we were able to paint a much clearer picture about why that was. So more often than not, and this goes for conversations on the road as well, we started having conversations with people about national security, and often, especially if they weren't from this sort of domain, or if they weren't working in government or a sort of institution that sort of had to deal in this space, they would be there would be low confidence in what they had to contribute, and very much a sense of second guessing what they had to offer. And then you would get into the conversation, and once they realised we were talking about things like disinformation, the impacts of climate change, foreign interference, economic impacts on people, a light bulb would go off, and they would really see that they had a lot to contribute. Now, when it came to the conversations with women, far more than the men, and I should also mention that the reason we know this is because we divided our 8 focus groups by both gender and life stage. Because those were the demographic details that really stood out in the survey work. And so in the focus groups, women would start off by saying, look, I don't know about any of this. I don't know what I've got to say. I don't know what you're going to get from me. And then the following hour would be spent with them telling us really sort of complex and explaining how their daily lives, the communities that they exist in, are impacted by the issues that we're facing as a nation, and how they, I guess, think about them on a day-to-day basis. So it would certainly be a mistake to assume that there is actually a knowledge gap there that women have, and it's more a matter of exclusion from what we've seen. So we certainly haven't gone into the depths of mapping this, but our colleague at the ANU, Elise Stevenson, certainly has done a lot of work in this domain, exploring, I guess, the historical roots and I guess, perceptions of inclusion in this space with regards to women in a whole range of national security adjacent fields. The other interesting thing is when it comes to younger cohorts of Australians, across the board, typically when we ask them about 15 threats in the survey, younger cohorts would report less concern. Now, it wasn't no concern. It was certainly elevated, I guess, objectively speaking. But compared to older cohorts, generally younger Australians felt the threats that we were, putting in front of them were less serious. Interestingly, and I think this is one of the things that's been picked up in media in the last sort of 24 hours or so, is the shift in people's worry about national security. And interestingly, I think that masks some really interesting findings from the report, because while we certainly have seen an increase in worry about national security, from the, I think, low 40s up until the low 60s in the space of 16 months or so, we certainly saw that younger people and women, like I mentioned, don't feel like they're part of the sort of national security conversation, or it's not necessarily relevant to them. And I think that goes to the sort of quote that I read out. But across those 16 months, interestingly, it were those two demographics that shifted most with regards to worry about national security. And so coming back to this idea about how important I think culture is, and the sort of relational elements of this, and the communications and the language that we're using, I think it's critical, because if we have a group of people or several groups of Australians who feel like they are potentially on the outside of these communications that they're getting from government or others in regard to the sort of threats that we're facing as a nation, I think it is certainly not leveraging the sort of capacity we have as a nation. And I completely agree with what you were saying earlier around we have everything we need. I feel quite optimistic, having sort of produced this report with the team. There are certainly confronting findings, but I think ultimately there is a story of optimism. I think Rory would probably use the word confidence, but I would certainly go one step further and say there's an optimism here. And it comes down to the fact that there's a level of interest, there's a level of recognition that the sort of Australian public have, but also beyond that, there's a question of agency. So in the one of the last questions we did in February of this year after Bondi was a question around, to what extent do you agree that all Australians have a place to play in keeping our communities peaceful and safe? And I think 73% of Australians said, yep, I agree with that, and only 8% disagreed. So I think that is a bit of a signal that there is a latent expectation that civic responsibility is certainly important here. And I think we have many of the ingredients we need to take the conversation forward.
Optimistic indeed. Just a quick follow-up question on the data. Was there a correlation between the extent to which someone would feel excluded from the conversation and levels of worry about national security? So the more excluded you feel, the more worried you are, or did that not come through?
I think using the gender question as a proxy for that, so I get the short answer is no, but using the gender as a proxy there, when we sort of investigated what women in our research were telling us, both in the survey work and in the focus groups, that there was a sense of perceived exclusion, but conversely there were high levels of worry, both with regards to national security, the sort of abstract notion of national security, but also the 15 or so threats that we put in front of them. So I think out of the 15, there were only 2 issues that men were more concerned about. And from memory, I think one was foreign interference and the other was disinformation.
Thanks very much. Could you please put your hands together for our excellent panellists?